Greetings, greetings. We'll be starting here shortly. Welcome. If you are joining for wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We'll wait one more minute, a couple of more seconds as people join on. Welcome. I am Dr. Andrea Bowens-Jones, and I'm excited to be back again to host another PNG Alumni Network Enrichment Series. A little bit about the Enrichment Series before we get started with today's topic. I'm excited to be here with Adam Newton, whom I will introduce more formally in just a few minutes. A little bit about our Enrichment Series. Welcome back if this is not your first time. If it is your first time joining us, a little bit about the series is that we are a monthly series that's a part of a larger effort through the PNG, a nonprofit, a 501c3, started by ex-PNGers. Our intent for the Enrichment Series is to connect members from all over the world, sharing our expertise with each other so that we can learn, provide insight, and be able to take it back into our personal and professional lives. Who we are, as I mentioned, we are a nonprofit of former PNGers. We have over 35,000 members worldwide with over 45 chapters in multiple countries, multiple states across the US. Officially, we are recognized by PNG, and our intent is to connect each other, enrich each other, and through our philanthropy efforts, be able to impact the world through giving. An announcement here, mark your calendars, November the 2nd through the 4th, we will have our biennial global conference. So if you were with us last year, we had that one virtually in Cincinnati. Next year, we'll be in Washington, D.C. And the intent is to bring together over hundreds of alumni for a multi-day program. We have speakers from all over, from high caliber speakers from all over, and an opportunity from us to learn and grow with each other. So there will be additional information. If you have questions, you can go to pgalum.com. So take a look at your screen. Let me give you a few logistics before we jump into today's topic. So if you're like me, I'm excited to hear about Adam's topic here, but I want you to be able to engage with us. You don't have to hold your questions until the end. You can plop those questions right into the QA function. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen, or feel free to use the chat function. We will have a designated Q&A portion of today's webinar, but I want to collect and see those questions coming in throughout. So you don't have to hold them. You can just go ahead and plop those in, and then we'll address them through the Q&A portion. Now, before we get started, there are a few poll questions that will appear on the screen. This is intended for us to kind of get to know our audience who's here with us today, and so we can better prepare content. So that questionnaire should be coming up on your screen here shortly. Just take a few moments to respond to those questions, and then we'll be able to get started. All right, the next question is coming up on the screen. You should see question number 2 on your screen. Tell us where you are in the world. All right, moving on to question number 3. Looks like we have almost everyone responding to question number 3. Question number 4. Hang in there. We just have one more question. Okay. And our final question, because we need to get to what we came here for. Are you about ready, Adam? Hopefully you are.
Sure.
Yes, great. And thank you for taking a moment to respond to the poll. That ends all of our questions for today. And with that, we'll get right into today's program. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. We are fortunate to have Adam Newton, who is still with P&G. He's a VP and Associate General Counsel with Ethics and Compliance Office. Adam is originally from Indianapolis, Indiana, where he earned his BA from Indiana University and JD from Vanderbilt University. Adam joined P&G in 2002, where he has since touched areas such as healthcare, corporate and security matters, and Gillette. He will be speaking on the topic of innovating in a compliance-focused environment. So with that, Adam, I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Excellent. And thank you so much for the invitation to speak in the lovely introduction. And thank you all for joining today, this morning or this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. It's a terrific agenda, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts. I've had a number of assignments with P&G, and I see some familiar faces. I was looking at the attendee list, so hello to those I've worked with before, and hello to those I've not. I also appreciate several folks reached out ahead of time to catch up in anticipation of the talk. So I definitely appreciate that. Because I'm in legal, I cannot help myself with a disclaimer, though I'm happy to provide this perspective today. I won't be sharing any particular risks or incidents or cases involving P&G. As you can imagine, any current ethics and compliance or legal areas are confidential to the project teams. So I'm really sharing my own thoughts and views today, not necessarily the perspective of P&G or the Ethics and Compliance Office. But within that, I hope there'll be some insights that resonate with you in your time at P&G or your time since. What we're going to talk about is the two forces at P&G that have really helped shape the company and its mission of serving consumers and shareholders in the communities around the world. And all of you, each of you, no matter your role, your tenure, your area of responsibility at P&G, have helped contribute to those forces. And then we're going to bring some of those thoughts together in a case study. So you may say, well, let's get started. What are those two forces? And we're going to explore each briefly. They are, of course, innovation and integrity. And with that, let's share some thoughts and slides here. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Now, of course, P&G has a long history of innovation, and I won't go through the full timeline of the heritage, but as you know, for those who have worked in the area of innovation, and I'm sure really all of us have in our roles, P&G people are curious, they're committed. They love finding new solutions to emerging problems. And though the issues over the years have changed, that spirit has not. You can look at the heritage from the founding of the company. 1841, James Gamble creates and obtains P&G's first utility patent for an apparatus that molds candles. And for there you see an unbroken succession of breakthrough R&D through acquisitions that brought new technologies into P&G and visionary scientists and technicians along the way. Like the recognition that families have to have or would want to have two different bars of soap, one for laundry, one for bathing. That was, of course, Ivory, and it took the country by storm. Or the insight in creating the first ever synthetic detergent for household use, or One of the acquisitions, the Oral-B toothbrushes that used soft nylon bristles, which a dentist first innovated out of concern for his patients' gum health. The first 2-in-1 shampoo and conditioner, first clinically proven fluoride in toothpaste to prevent and help prevent tooth decay. First ingredient to help reduce dandruff in shampoo, Head and Shoulders. The alternative to using the straight razor to improve shaving, to provide a safer and more convenient way to shave. The list goes on, and you can see many of those innovations here. But it's not just scientific, of course, it's also branding. This here is the first ivory ad in 1882. And if you look at this ad, what's most interesting, and this is, I'm no expert on heritage, but you can see that the name Procter & Gamble doesn't appear. Instead, it tells a brand story about the special product and the qualities and benefits it offers. That's how the company first innovated on brand building and focusing on different brands to meet different needs. But of course, as we all know, the consumer is boss. And it's really that insight that helped pioneer the first advertising, which launched in June 29th, 1838, a print ad for machine and lamp oil. That followed, from that, of course, followed entries into commercial radio, the first radio soap operas, the first to pioneer data-based market research for consumers. It goes on and on. So as you see, it's not just technical innovation, but it's also how we go to market, all with an idea towards improving consumers' lives with irresistible products. Of course, it's not just the marketing. The strong performance benefits are part of ensuring repeat use to consumers, in that habits and practices for the brands came to be built on trust, both in what we say, how we advertise, and the product performance that our consumers enjoy at the home. It's built on trust, and that's equally part of P&G Heritage. Integrity, the other force, trust. And folks at P&G are hopefully familiar with this inspirational quote from James Gamble about just the honesty of fair dealing. Building a reputation for selling quality products and being a company built on ethics. This quote came from the mid-1800s, so that goes to show how far back this heritage goes on earning and maintaining every day consumer trust and trust among the businesses that do business with P&G, including this storefront, early Chicago storefront selling P&G products. And you see another echo of this integrity, the highest grade, honest weight, as being central to our business model, even in the early days. And that goes on. Fair dealing was a long part of P&G's heritage, but the specific articulation of the PVPs, the purpose, values, and principles that are so central to P&G's way of doing business, though the spirit and the philosophy has been part of P&G's foundation, that specific articulation only really arose in the mid-1980s. And it was formalized as part of a statement of purpose, as you see here, in the mid-1980s, under the leadership of John Pepper at the time, when the company was acquiring a number of businesses, Vicks, Noxell, Max Factor, and we wanted to share to them the kind of company that they were joining. And we wanted to demonstrate that P&G was a place of strong values and principles to build the culture of the company and reinforce it and promote it. So you see the statement of purpose, which evolved over time to become the PVPs. The other foundational document is the Worldwide Business Conduct Manual. That would come later in 1995 as part of an industry focus on corporate compliance. And you see its evolution over the years, the last 25 years, and several updates until today, where we have, of course, today we still stand by the Worldwide Business Conduct Manual. It's available publicly, and we've recently digitized it, if you're interested, to ewbcm.pg.com. That should be available to anyone with a public intranet access, because we're certainly proud of that document and live by it. So you can see it in an interactive format, leading to the purpose, values, and principles that, again, are hopefully familiar to all P&Gers, current and the alumni. the mission we all share of delighting consumers, helping them improve their lives in everyday ways with quality products. It's who we are and why our consumers and stakeholders trust us. Now, that trust has been so central to P&G's mission, but it's really been part of the formal expectations of all companies only in a more recent era. So it's probably good to take a moment to think about the external environment beyond just P&G's own internal commitment as a part of our company's character and culture to doing the right thing. That also happens to be the expectation from outside regulators. I'm in the United States, but this is echoed and resonated in other regulators around the world. But let's focus for the moment on the US. As companies grew larger and bigger and had bigger impacts on their communities and economies, the formal expectation and the formal program of corporate compliance started about 30 years ago as part of the US federal sentencing guidelines. And its elements included practices to deter and detect crime from the Department of Justice. And the regulators first started offering incentives and guidance on how companies would go about doing that, how to have reporting systems and controls and safeguards. And if companies had that in place, no program is perfect. The government would recognize that in the event of wrongdoing or misconduct, that having a compliance program in place, an effective compliance program in place, would help reduce the penalties when it came time to sentencing if wrongdoing were to unfortunately take place. Around this time, you see the first trade association for ethics and compliance professionals in 1992. And then, over the years, corporate scandals happen. Not at P&G, but at other companies. And that also led to legislation beyond the federal sentencing guidelines, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and others, if you've followed those or been affected by those as far as how companies do work. And just in the 25 years since, the DOJ, Department of Justice, continues to provide guidance and regulations and policies to encourage corporate transparency, corporate reporting, and corporate compliance, which leads to really the overall central purpose of these programs, which is compliance is really about self-governance. How can externally and also internally the right incentives and oversight be created to encourage self-governance by employees and managers? Because the best kinds of problems are the ones that never happen in the first place. So how do we anticipate and prevent wrongdoing? And if it does start to take place, how can we encourage employees to speak up and report it and share their concerns, even in the face of fearing, reprisal or just even social pressure of not speaking up and sharing their concerns? And that's what programs like this are designed to encourage and reward. In short, as the expectations involved, the idea of, as one colleague of mine put it, lawful but awful corporate behavior became no longer an option. And again, as we discussed in the slides previously, that happily wasn't a concern at P&G, but we're of course part of the corporate compliance efforts as part of all of industry. And so we adapted our programs accordingly. Now it's interesting, I was looking at some statistics preparing for this talk. And in the last 30 years, the DOJ, at least in the US, Department of Justice, has kept records on how many companies have come before them under these programs for wrongdoing and to present their compliance programs as to demonstrate the efforts they've taken to mitigate the sentencing. And we've seen a pattern of offense types. So if you're wondering what are we really talking about, what kind of offenses are we talking about? The bulk of them, at least in the last 30 years, 80% have fallen into 6 offense types externally, at least for prosecution by the federal authorities. They fall in fraud, that's the leader, then environmental concerns and charges, antitrust concerns, food and drug violations, money laundering, and then import-export crimes, totaling for a total at least according to the records for these offense types of around 5,000 companies that have come before the DOJ. Now, aside from sort of the penalties, which is sort of the, I suppose, on the carrot and stick, the government encourages compliance because of concern of enforcement. They've also put forth guidelines and helpful roadmaps on how companies can think about compliance to build their own programs to detect and deter wrongdoing. Now, these requirements are not sort of risk specific. Of course, the regulators and the commentators provide guidance and best practices on consumer protection and privacy and fair competition and corporate securities. This overarches all of that. It's all about, regardless of the subject area, how do we think about what effective compliance looks like? And the idea is that it's not just about companies avoiding penalties, but it's also creating the proper conditions within a company such that employees and the systems and processes and policies they work with help ensure that the right thing is done, even when people aren't explicitly told it, even when no one's looking. How do we have assurance that people are doing the right thing? And though there's a guide and long guides that are quite helpful with detailed questions, it boils down to these three questions you see here in the DOJ's last updated compliance program guidance. And they're really pretty common sense. Is the compliance program well designed? Is it being applied in good faith, meaning earnestly and sincerely with proper resources? It's not just as they say in the trade, a paper program. And then in practice, how do we know it works? How does a company know it works in practice? It's not just you write a policy in a piece of paper and hope everyone follows it. So within those three helpful questions, you see, the guidance itself has I think over 100 sub-questions, and there are many, many pages of commentary, both from the government and also from other, law firms and analysts and the consultants outlining the elements of an effective compliance program. And this brings us to perhaps what might be perceived as a tension, which is kind of the heart of our discussion. After the many pages and many questions and checklists and things to think about in due diligence, not just within the company, but also the vendors that serve the company, the third parties, the suppliers, the consultants. How do we know that they're doing the right thing on behalf of P&G? It's a whole ecosystem of behavior that needs to be have oversight and control over. Wow, that's a lot. How do we think about all the questions and the laws and the regulations? At the same point, innovation is about being entrepreneurial, ideating with agility, asking what if without constraints. Doesn't that present or seem to present a tension, a drag on innovation? The idea of having to comply and follow not just the law, of course, P&G, and we would hope all of its employees and have confidence they are trained to follow the law, but just also the guidance, the checklist, the best practices. It's a lot to keep track of. Doesn't that constrain and hamper innovation? Now, the answer, or else it would be a pretty short talk for us today, is no. It doesn't hamper innovation. In some ways, it actually enhances innovation. And to explain why, permit me, if you will, to offer a metaphor. It's not original to me. It's another colleague at mine at P&G shared it, but it really captures so well why compliance serves innovation. It actually helps companies move faster. And the metaphor is this: imagine you're driving down a hilly, winding road, and night is starting to fall, and the terrain is unfamiliar. And on each side, the shoulder kind of drops off into a steep ravine. And so you flick on your headlights, but headlights can only help you see so far. The last thing you want to do is sort of oversteer or turn too sharply as you're navigating this road, misjudge a curve, and you go skidding off into the ravine, and which would not be good. So what do? You slow down, right? You ride the brake. You really take extra caution to avoid oversteering and steering off the edge. You imagine the worst case scenario. You can almost and see it in your mind of feeling that the tire loses its grip on the road because you're feeling just a little bit out of control. That's not the ideal time when you're in that circumstance to think big thoughts, right? To dream up new innovations, to think about brilliant solutions to new problems, because you're more concerned about the fundamental question about how to keep the car on the road and drive it. And so if only there were guardrails, if there were boundaries, if there were markers and signs and fences, where someone has gone before you and thought carefully about the riskiest parts of the road, anticipated possible slips, been there with a preventative sign to say, warn you and say, hey, slow down here, watch out, there's a sharp curve ahead, to guide you, to steer you, so you can stay in control and have confidence to go even faster. That is the role of compliance. So let's leave our driver idling down this long highway, fearful of touching the accelerator for fear of spinning out. And let's take a different case study to kind of bring some thoughts to life. Let's consider the world of eggs. And this, of course, is probably a silly hypothetical example, but let's go with it. Let's imagine you're leading a company called Farm to Table Transport, and you're the leader, and you're very excited because business is growing. It's a new company, and you're starting to get a leadership position in milk and cheese and fruits and vegetables. But there's some really interesting upstream work that you and the team are looking at around eggs. But you're worried because the biggest risk, your biggest exposure on a legal and reputational and consumer satisfaction front is putting all of your eggs in one basket. Okay, now that's a silly example, and I'll unpack it in a minute, but let me offer my second of two probably unnecessary and silly legal disclaimers, because as I said, I'm in legal and I can't stop and help myself. To be clear, P&G does not have a farm business. I'm not advocating for or against egg production. I certainly don't condone negligence in dropping eggs or breaking them. This is just a silly example. And of course, we follow all appropriate ethical farming practices and humane treatment of all operations on our farm. The problem here, as we'll learn, is the eggs and the baskets that we're transporting them in. And I'm using this silly example because do not put all of your eggs in a single basket, of course, is a classic saying around risk mitigation. And as part of this presentation, I did a deep dive, I can't help myself, into this quote. And where did it come from? I was curious. And apparently it's been around for 500 years and is attributed anyway to Cervantes and Don Quixote. Who knew? I certainly didn't. That putting all the eggs in one basket is a risky behavior. So I had fun looking up that origin. But the point of this illustration, which we'll go through in a minute, is not about the farm or the animals or even the economics, but it's really about transporting the eggs in the very dubious baskets that we're using as a company and our employees are using, or those who are involved in egg transport, to carry the eggs to market. So with that silly disclaimer aside, let's get back to our example. We're concerned about putting all of our eggs in one basket and carrying the eggs to new markets. But what do we do about that concern, other than just worry and maybe have some sleepless nights and thinking our new products, these eggs, are going to show up to market broken? What can we do other than tell people, hey, don't do it? How do we build in the right controls, the right oversight, the right process? That's where compliance comes in. And the good news is there are formalized and sort of systematized end-to-end concepts that help at every step of risk mitigation. And this is where we have what another colleague of mine calls the science of compliance. Really an end-to-end framework that applies compliance thinking at every step of the operations, falling in these elements, which we'll unpack in a moment. Now, these elements themselves are based on other regulatory guidance, including the guidance from the Department of Justice that I shared with you, industry papers, and consultants' commentaries looking at how do we think about building effective and not overlapping controls end to end. And the interesting thing, at least for me, having worked in P&G legal over the years, is how this is certainly related to the law, but not entirely. And that's because, and this is as I've come in this role to appreciate, and as is seen in when you look at some of the commentators, legal and compliance are overlapped, but not the same in all respects. Of course, we follow the law. I mean, that goes without saying, that's compliance, but that's just a starting point. Compliance really is about risk mitigation. Risk is, of course, the risk of following the laws, but risk, more broadly speaking, is just really about uncertainty. And that can arise from legal requirements. It can also arise from reputational concerns. It can arise from not meeting consumer expectations. So when we think about risk in that broader sense of how do we account for uncertainty, and then how do we build in the right programs and the right oversight to regulate or self-regulate that uncertainty, then you start to see that it's bigger than law in some respects. Now, I didn't say better than the law because it's different. In some ways, though we have a discrete legal division at P&G, compliance is broader, and we know this because many functions work in compliance. In fact, I would say all P&G employees have an element of compliance in their jobs because they are expected to do the right thing and follow the policies and procedures specific to their role. Whereas legal more is concerned on the external requirements of challenges by consumers or litigation, and thinking about how best to defend the company from risk. Compliance is about self-regulation and controlling for uncertainty in these formalized ways. So let's take the first of these, and we'll kind of go through these with, again, our example of egg transport, putting all the eggs in one basket. And it starts with, what risk are we dealing with really? When we say, don't put all your eggs in one basket, what does really that mean? It starts with, okay, aside from having that sort of appreciation, that uncertainty of eggs breaking, where do we need to focus our efforts on building the right controls? And I won't read these questions, but you can get a flavor of them. And it has to do with profiling and mapping your risk through a risk assessment. Who deals with the eggs? Who carries them? What number of employees? Well, it's not the employees in the office who are working on the advertising, for example. It's not the employees who are in legal, who are filing the permits to build your plants or engage in the environmental permits. It is the employees working on egg production. Now, that may sound obvious, but then that is the first step of risk mitigation. What kind of a container do they use today? How far do they have to walk? Under what circumstances do they put all their eggs in one basket? Is that because they have to make multiple trips? It's more efficient to have, and how big are those baskets? Again, silly examples, but I think you're starting to appreciate what is the probability of the risk given rise to, the risk of putting all the eggs in one basket. What is the magnitude of harm if that event were to come to pass? And how likely is it that the eggs would break if they put the eggs in one basket? And if it does happen, what's the impact to you? Could we quickly bring more eggs into production, or is the harm given rise to by the eggs in one basket, what is the speed of onset of that risk? And then, of course, when you do the risk assessment, you have to make sure that when you sit down and interview people or look at the data, it's not just a snapshot of a single day, because businesses can be seasonal. Your egg production probably is seasonal, but you want to look at risk over an entire cycle, an entire quarter, an entire year, whatever period is appropriate for your business. You want to make sure you have a sense of the end-to-end risk assessment. That risk assessment, why is that part of innovation? Because it helps you know where really your risk profile is. It is not the case that every employee in every role at every level, no matter where they're located, gives rise to the same level of risk, or at least this kind of risk in the same way. So then you can invest appropriately and then make sure you have a current assessment. So know where your risk lies. Okay, let's say we do that, right? And then we say, okay, what do we do about that risk? Well, okay, it seems to me we're going to want to sit down and say, well, we need a policy to make sure employees follow the rules on carrying their eggs. Well, what are the rules? Well, we have to write them. Now, if there's a law on egg transport, that means it's pretty easy, follow the law. But in some cases, the policies of companies go beyond the law. In other cases, there is no single law on that topic, so you'll need to develop a policy. And a policy is really just a summary of management expectations. What, as a leader, as owner of the business, if you could put everyone in a room and tell them your expectations about egg transport, what would that be? And write that down. That's a policy. Now, of course, you have to make sure it is uses clear terms. What does it mean to use a basket? Don't put all our eggs in one basket. What about a bucket? Is a bucket okay? What about putting all in my hands, right? Would that be okay? That's what I mean about defining terms and making sure the policy is clear and can apply to a number of use cases. What if I use 2 baskets, one in each hand, but it's a single trip? Is that the same level of risk? Or is it the fact I'm carrying both at the same time, or it's in one container or receptacle that creates the risk? What about 99% of all of my eggs in one basket? I take one egg and leave it aside. Is that a risk? I'm being silly, but hopefully you're getting my point. How to operationalize the risk assessment we just did requires you to think through all the scenarios in which the risk is given rise to, and then write them down. Once you write them down, how do you make sure employees get them? Do you post them on a wall? Do you put them in the break room? Do you send it via email? Maybe yes to all of those things. Do you post it on an intranet site somewhere? And if so, which one? How do you make sure employees, including new hires who are constantly joining your business, are exposed to these expectations? If you have operations in more than one country or more than one region, do you need to translate the policies? Maybe so. And then, of course, risk assessments, we've talked about it, are updated. So too should be the policies, or at least reviewed to make sure they're refreshed. Why do we do all this? Bringing us back to innovation. It helps employees, gets them on literally and figuratively the same page, so they understand the requirements, and gives us a common vocabulary. Back to my silly example on basket. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Well, if when I say basket, I'm thinking in my mind bucket, and you're thinking kind of a wicker receptacle, does that mean the same thing? I don't know, but the policy will help make sure everyone has a common understanding. And then also explains the why behind the policies. It gives people a sense of the risk you're trying to avoid, not just policy for policy's sake, but you're trying to help protect the business and promote its results, which benefits everyone. All right, so once we've defined the policy, once we've identified the risk, defined the policy, their expectations, we want to make sure employees are constantly aware of the expectations. They're trained once, okay, fine. You send the policy in a single email blast, okay, fine. But how do we make sure it remains top of mind? Now we get back to our risk assessment, because it may not be, let's say you have 50,000 employees. It may not be that every single of those 50,000 employees needs constant reminders or periodic reminders. Maybe just a single reminder is good enough for employees working, in milk production, for example, on your farm. But employees who work in egg transport probably need more periodic reminders, just so it stays top of mind. Is that delivered live? Is that delivered online? If there's a new hire, how do you reach them? And then do you identify a resource? If you have questions, come talk to us. Come talk to who? Is it you as the leader of the organization? Is it someone in human resources? Do you have a subject matter expert of the chief egg transport officer? This is what we mean by raising awareness and training beyond just posting the policy, building in the reminders that employees keep it top of mind. This helps innovation because it ensures ongoing awareness that employees, as they do their daily work, know and can anticipate and design in compliance, knowing what the expectations are. But again, it's not all of your 50,000 employees. It's just those who are in, if I may say, the high-risk functions who do the work. And they can build in the right controls and safeguards so it's not reworked later. Okay, next on our circle, our science of compliance, to quote my colleague, we have to think about culture. And that's a rather amorphous word. So let me kind of break it down. PNG is proud of its do the right thing culture, and it's not easily built or won. It has to do with instilling in employees the awareness that of choosing the right thing to do, even when no one's looking, to doing the right thing, even if the policy doesn't say it. Now, why do we even raise this as a concept? It's because we've taken great care with our policy. We've defined a basket as not a bucket, but a wicker basket. But there is no possible way we can anticipate every scenario, every question, we can't legislate every aspect of human behavior with a policy, or else we'd have 57,000 policies at the company. It would be unworkable. I had a colleague who used to say, obviously in humor, but it was a very good insight. Look, there's no policy against riding a horse down the hallway at Procter & Gamble, but you still shouldn't do it. Now, why is that? Why do we say that? There's no policy against it, means I can do it. Well, no, not really. That's where culture comes in. Culture is creating at least that awareness that, gosh, this may not be the right thing to do. And if I'm unsure, I should go talk to somebody. I should go talk to HR, go talk to my manager, go talk to legal, go talk to a governance a manager to understand, how do we operate in this gray area if there's no explicit policy on it. My silly example here, but I think hopefully it illustrates the point, is juggling. In all of our work, gosh, we forgot to have a policy on juggling eggs. We talked about eggs in baskets, we didn't have juggling. Well, let's say a friend of yours says, hey, let's go juggle those eggs. And you say, well, I don't think we should do that. Why? There's no policy against it. Why? The reason why is it has the same concern about breaking eggs, which is bad for business and bad for the consumer. So this is what we mean by culture: anticipating and honing employees' ethical judgments to anticipate new circumstances. And hopefully, if we do this, we can avoid problems arising in the first place. It's easy to write a policy after a bad thing has happened, because we are like, oh, we should have anticipated that. Let's write a policy so that it never happens again. And that's okay. That's part of remediation. But even better if the problem never happens in the first place. And that's the role of culture. But even culture, policies, awareness, that's not enough. We still need oversight. There'll be some people who are especially trained as subject matter experts for egg transport, the people who are the gatekeepers of the policy, to whom people can ask questions, who are asked to monitor operations, identify deviations, and they are empowered to control and verify and investigate, if need be, the concerns arising in that role. Now, that's not your role as the leader. Your role is to oversee the entire operations. This is oversight as to that risk, that they're the owner of that risk of ensuring the right monitoring. They need to be empowered to do their job. If they're saying, hey, please don't juggle the eggs. Why? There's no policy against it. Well, it's the wrong thing to do, right? They need to be empowered to provide that insight, that guidance, and if need be, escalate it to the right managers if people, frankly, are not following their guidance about not juggling eggs in the absence of a policy, or getting the right authority and resources and autonomy to go write a policy on juggling eggs. So you see, it's a specialized role beyond just the manager of that employee involved in egg transport. Think of them as gatekeepers, subject matter experts. And the reason why this helps innovation is it helps you segment and specialize that role such that while everyone is expected to comply and follow and self-regulate, there are a few designated people who are trained to do the deep thinking on what does compliance look like for this risk area, including keeping an eye on external events. Maybe there are new regulations or industry trends that means we need to make our baskets smaller or bigger, or make the size of our eggs smaller or bigger, or what have you. Again, silly examples, but you get the idea. It has to do with keeping engaged externally to make sure we continue to manage the risk appropriately. Now, we talked a little bit about monitoring. That's certainly the expectation of the oversight, the gatekeepers, but specifically beyond just kind of keeping an eye on things and people in the field, there are the concept of having the right systems and processes to generate data that we can look at effective operations and give assurance of effective controls. This is increasingly the domain of data analytics, and you'll see this increasingly part of compliance programs and expectations externally. But in our silly example, let's talk about, well, if we have X number of employees working in egg transport, and there are Y number of eggs produced per hour, keeping an eye on the efficiency of how those eggs are carried. And through that data, I'm no math expert, right? But I'm sure an algorithm could be run to figure out, are employees really carrying their eggs in one basket or not, when you look at the time it takes to transport the eggs, the number of trips, the average number of eggs per carry, the number of employees we have, and we could really get a sense of our employees following the rules and expectations on egg transport or not. Because if there are too many eggs carried by a given person in a given hour, again, by algorithm, at least that provides I wouldn't say an automatic guarantee of violation, but at least a red flag, right? That should be investigated and audited to look at whether our expectations are being met. I mentioned the word audit. That's obviously for folks who have worked with or been part of global internal audit. That's certainly part of it. Also, the policy owners themselves, the gatekeepers, the ones who provide the oversight, can also provide the monitoring activities. The benefit of this from an innovation standpoint is it helps us continually adjust as things go on. It wouldn't be good enough to set the policies, the training, set the gatekeepers in their place and say, okay, well, everything's solved now. You need to monitor it, make sure our expectations continue to be met. Now, I have to say, unfortunately, sometimes that doesn't happen. There are times at which violations can and do happen. Why? Because you have 50,000 employees at your company. They're all filled by human beings. And they all try to do the right thing, but all of us are susceptible to forces of bad judgment, or as you can read about the literature, the fraud triangle, but I think it's broadly applied beyond fraud. This idea that everyone is capable of pressure to do the wrong thing. Everyone is presented with opportunity. Maybe there are gaps in our controls or our compliance or our policies where they feel the pressure, and then they see an opportunity to deviate, to not follow the policy. And then there's rationalization. Those pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. Rationalization is important as a consideration because most employees like to think themselves as doing the right thing and following the rules. So we have to anticipate that some employees will try to rationalize it, saying, well, if I put all the eggs in this basket, no one's getting hurt. I'll be really, really careful, and I'll walk very, very slowly. And it's not really hurting anyone. As long as no eggs get broken, it's not hurting anyone. Or I'm doing it because I'm trying to help the business, and I need to meet the production quota for transport. So it's worth taking that risk, and I can put all my eggs in one basket and kind of sprint to the next checkpoint to deliver my eggs. But I'm not doing it for myself. I'm doing it for the company, and that's rationalization. So all of us are susceptible to those forces. When that happens, do we have the right reporting and response measures to investigate? Now, employees or the alumni, but on this call are probably familiar with PNG's helpline, but it's actually not even limited to employees. It's really open to anyone. It's just publicly available. Suppliers, consultants, third parties who work with PNG are encouraged and invited to share concerns of wrongdoing. If they see something, we ask them to speak up about potential misconduct or violations. Now, as part of that, critical to that is that we ensure that those who do speak up are protected from retaliation. That's not only a requirement of the law, but it is part of doing the right thing, and it's also part of effective compliance. People are going to speak up and share concerns about seeing a colleague or even a manager violate a policy if they're don't feel protected and safe for doing so. Part of that, where the law allows, and most jurisdictions it is allowed, is having a mechanism to provide those complaints and concerns anonymously. Where employees really are anxious, they can provide the complaint anonymously, and PNG is no exception. We encourage people to share concerns with their managers or with legal or finance or HR or internal audit. But there's also a mechanism to go externally on the helpline, as I mentioned a moment ago, which is staffed by an external party, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that can intake concerns through a phone call or through a sort of a web portal, including anonymously, and provide their concerns. Now, when that happens, there's an expectation, and certainly at PNG and other companies, that they be investigated. And by investigated, that sounds super formal, but it really just means there's some fact finding by trained, objective, impartial, certified experts. So there's an inquiry internally to gather documents and understand the concerns that were raised. Is there any basis to them, both factually, meaning were the concerns accurately reported, but also even if the facts are true, do they give rise to a violation? I'll use a silly example. Again, a hypothetical. Let's say you have an employee call up and complain about that the food in your cafeteria, is always served cold. Well, that's a good faith concern. Let's assume they're being sincere, and let's assume even the food is cold. That's a report we still want to take in and we still want to receive, but that itself doesn't present evidence of a violation. It's just employee displeasure. So that information may be provided to the cafeteria, managers for their awareness, but there's no investigation as far as determining if there's misconduct. So while there is a wide funnel on all kinds of reports, not everything is investigated, but anything that suggests a potential violation of policy or process or our PVPs or the business conduct manual, or of course the law, is investigated. And there's a determination made on whether there has been a violation. And always, we make sure the employee feels protected. This is important because it provides organizational justice. We want to make sure people feel comfortable speaking up and sharing concerns. And then that there is appropriate discipline. And now that discipline varies by local law. But by discipline, we just really mean consequences for wrongdoing and violations. And then that there's learning from that. If both on an individual level, but if an employee took advantage of a ambiguous policy or process, and there's appropriate discipline and consequences for that employee, and then we look at, okay, does a policy or process need to be improved? How can we find a root cause and ensure this doesn't happen again? Because we can't just rely on people speaking up, sharing concerns as our means of detection and governance and oversight. We have to learn from this systemically. So let's bring it all together. We've taken a stop in each of our 7 sort of bubbles here, and we see hopefully how this all kind of feeds itself, right? That risk assessment leads to detecting where our risks lie, where our uncertainties lie, and that is also illustrated and brought to the fore by audits and investigations and finding deviations. And that finds weaknesses in policies or maybe training or culture. That in turn informs policies, training, and culture. Where do we need to improve? Where do we need to clarify? Where do we need to strengthen? Where do we need to have more training, better focus? And so you can see it kind of feeds itself. This all helps innovate because we can build tailored controls that really that are responsive to the true risks that we face, the true uncertainties, where they actually lie. And that helps us make the better investment decisions. At the end of the day, compliance, of course, is doing the right thing for its own sake, no doubt. And that's part of PNG's heritage, as we talked of at the beginning of our discussion. But it also, we follow the law, and that's, again, who we are. But there are also some business benefits to compliance. It helps us steer the business, knowing where the trends are. The data shows where our risks and our gaps and opportunities are. It allows us to disproportionately invest in the areas where the risk is greatest. Instead of training and having the same controls for 50,000 employees, let's focus disproportionately on those who are most responsible for the activities giving rise to that risk. And that helps us right-size compliance and allow the other functions to to focus on other things other than compliance beyond the baseline expectations, of course. It allows us to focus on culture, to encourage people to feel safe, speaking up, surfacing issues, which is important as part of compliance, but it's also really important for retention. Employees are generally happier where they feel safe and protected and able to raise concerns if something troubles them. That also is good for business. And then looking at it externally, of course, a company that has effective compliance, effective controls, knows its risks, knows its operations, that's going to earn trust from and respect and credibility from regulators, from consumers. That allows us to then innovate and continue to delight them. So innovation through compliance, the answer, hopefully we would agree after the end of our discussion, is yes, because it turns this into this, where we have the guardrails and allows us to focus, knowing where our risks are, and then hit the accelerator on the straightaways and innovate. So with that, I will pause at the end of my time here and see if there are any questions or further comments. So thanks for your attention today. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. I love your analogy with the eggs, your story there. I'll never think, and I'm sure all those that joined us, about having all the eggs in one basket. I learned a lot. So we do have some questions in our chat box. First question is, how do you think of internal controls audit as part of the compliance program? I know you mentioned a little bit about the monitoring piece. So can you speak to that?
Sure. So I suppose, and I'm not internal audit, but I work with those who do. So I would defer to their answer. But I guess from my answer as an observer and one who relies on their services, is internal audit helps provide that oversight area we talked about, and that auditing function. They, as the literature would say, external literature, function as a third line of defense. So not the employees engaged in the actual operational activities giving rise to the risk, nor those sort of setting the standards and writing the policies, but saying once the policies or standards are written, GIA, Global Internal Audit, or audit as they may be known at other companies, provide that risk assurance to say, okay, now that we've written the policies, are employees actually following them, and how do we know that? It's more than just assuming it. If we had to demonstrate it and provide positive assurance, what is the data that shows the right controls and processes are in place? So it's, I suppose the shorter answer is as a third line of defense, not necessarily the subject matter expert of that policy or those who work in that area, but ones who then read the policy and then line it up to our operations and identify any gaps.
Okay.
Very important.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely agree with that one. Another question for you. How does P&G reconcile ethical compliance and judgment to do no harm and our social media providers who participate in privacy exploitation, dark patterns, and the infinite scroll?
Gosh,
Lot in that question, yes.
I'm certainly no privacy expert, but I'll answer at a more general level, which is we do have expectations that our suppliers and providers have similar commitment to doing the right thing. Of course, we can't impose, other than by contract, our employee policies on their employees because of co-employment issues, but we can and do set forth our expectations in contracts, as well as our measurements and of performance when they have delivery, and by doing due diligence in the first place. It's a good question on external third parties, because part of qualifying them for doing business is going through a risk assessment. Depending on the work they do, many of them go undertake third-party risk management. And the same way there might be a background check for a new hire at P&G, so too our third parties are vetted to ensure they have both the capabilities to deliver on our contract expectations and the ethical commitments to do so as well.
Awesome. And one last question before we wrap up. The hour went by so fast, is around culture. You talked a little bit about culture, but in this day and age where you see so many companies in the news, in the media, once that's established, how does a company walk themselves back? Once it's broken, how does a company walk themselves back to create that culture of integrity?
It's a great question. There's a quote that I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember it offhand, but I think Warren Buffett said it takes a generation to build trust and integrity, and it takes about 20 minutes to lose it. So you're absolutely right in that once a culture is broken, it is so difficult to repair externally from a credibility standpoint. You see, and I won't list them, but many corporate scandals out there, but also internally that employees have trust in the company and their leaders. And I guess I would say the short answer is, in our time remaining, is that is the critical aspect of tone from the top, a phrase you hear about ethical leadership. Managers who at every level, not just the senior leadership, but of course they're the most visible, but at every level demonstrate in everything they do the right tone and the right role model of behavior. And in time that can rebuild trust. But it it is why culture is so important, because it's something that companies have to work at every single day.
Oh, great. One last question. I know we're at the top of the hour, but
Sure.
we just had one come in. Can you spot any differences on how this applies in businesses more focused on creativity? For example, ad agencies like the likes of Pixar and et cetera.
Oh, how interesting.
Mhm.
Not working in that field, I'd be speculating, but I do think the good news is about the science of compliance, if I can use that term, or some of the elements we looked at. It is designed by regulators to be broadly applied across industry. Now, this is why risk assessments are so important, right? So the risk assessment for a creative business may not be the same as our silly example on egg transport, but they would have risks on intellectual property, I am sure, on workforce management like anyone else, on privacy to the extent that they are interacting with their audiences and getting data about what audiences want to see in their entertainment product. So I guess the answer would be those kinds of differences that's why the risk assessment is kind of our first step. But I think the same schematic would apply regardless of business, is just starting with understanding what particular risks they're facing. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I was saying thank you so much for
Oh,
hanging
great.
in there and answering that one last
No,
question
thank
as
you.
we wrap up today. It has been a pleasure hosting today's session. I would like to point out a few announcements as we kind of wrap up today's talk. Please mark your calendars and join us next month for our next session, Empowerment from Conviction to Catalyst. And this is a panel discussion with conversation with three powerful women that have learned to kind of apply their passions to kind of drive change in this world. So that is October 11th at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And here's a snapshot of what's happening over the next 90 days. So today was our talk with Adam. Next month, I've already mentioned that one with our panel discussion. But then in November, we'll bring back the Catapult Pitch finalists. If you remember, you were with us last year when the pitch finalists were announced at our global webinar, global conference. This is an opportunity to see where they are now. So I'm excited about that one. And then we'll wrap up the year with David Taylor, former chairman and board of director of PNG. So I'm excited about that one. And you can see the list of all the other upcoming events. So today is just a snippet of some of the things that are offered through the PNG Alumni Network. So get involved, and you can get involved by signing up for updates on pgalums.com or even emailing us to get involved locally and be a part of the foundation. Today's session was recorded, and we will have the recording on our YouTube channel so that you can stay up to date, go back, relearn, rehash, or take notes from any of the things that were shared today or in previous webinars. Please go and like and share and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and that's PNG Alumni Network. And one last thing, if you have questions or comments or even topics, you can email us at hello@pgalums.com. So with that, I'd like to thank you once again on behalf of the network, Adam, for spending this time with us and sharing and teaching us about compliance and innovation. And with that, I tell everybody, bye-bye. Have a great afternoon, morning, or rest of the day. Until next time. Bye. Bye.